Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be thinking about the best chords to use on the approach to a diminished seventh. I'll recap on the diminished seventh chord briefly in a moment, but it's all very well if you know what a diminished seventh is, but you're not quite sure, well, which chord goes before it. So it's worth just thinking about that. So quick recap on what is a diminished seventh. Well, basically a diminished seventh is a pile of minor thirds. So if I start with the note B and I put a minor third above it, that's D. I put a minor third above it, that's F. I put a minor third above F, it's A flat. So B, D, F, A flat, that's a diminished seventh chord. So if you've got minor thirds between those notes, you know you're dealing with a diminished seventh chord. Now, beyond that, it's possible to key reference a diminished seventh by bearing in mind that a diminished seventh is built on chord 7. So if I'm in C major, here's my scale of C major. Here are my diatonic chords, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So chord 7, you notice, is a diminished chord. That's because it's got a minor third above the bottom and a diminished fifth above the bottom. But B to D is a minor third and D to F is also a minor third. So it's a diminished chord, but the diminished chord is made up of two minor thirds, B to D, D to F. So I stick another minor third on the top, so minor third above F, A flat, and that gives me a diminished seventh in the key of C. Could be C major, could be C minor. It's exactly the same chord. Okay, now the only thing to say about this, just to be sure about the key referencing, is that the enharmonics matter. What do I mean by that? Enharmonics, same note, but possibly with a different name. So I'm saying this is B, D, F, A flat. But what would happen if I said, well, actually, that's not A flat, it's G sharp? Well, if I called that G sharp, the chord still sounds exactly the same, so no difference there. But B to D, minor third, D to F, minor third. But F to G sharp is now an augmented second. So as soon as I come across one augmented second in my diminished seventh chord, I know that the chord is in an inversion. So if you want to key reference it, get back to root position. So B, D, F, G sharp. In order to get to root position, I need all those notes to be a minor third apart without any augmented seconds. So that means I've got to say G sharp is at the bottom, B, D, F, because G sharp to B is a minor third, B to D is a minor third, D to F is another minor third. So you can now see that when I call it G sharp instead of A flat, it's changing the key orientation because the bottom of this, G sharp B, D, is now chord 7 in the key of A major or A minor. Yeah? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, G sharp B, D, F. So if I've got it with B at the bottom, B, D, F, G sharp, that's a diminished seventh in the key of A, but now it's in first inversion. So you can see how the enharmonics affect the key referencing. Now, if you're sort of thinking, oh, this is all too much for me, I can't be bothered with this, that's fine, that's great. As long as you've got notes a minor third apart, you are dealing with a diminished seventh chord. But if you want to be able to think, actually, which key is this in? Which inversion is it in? Then you have to do what I've just done. Get the chord into a place, into a position where you've got genuine minor thirds between those notes and nothing is an augmented second. then you know that that is in root position and it's based on chord 7. So the bottom 3 notes are spelling out chord 7 of your key. You can then say, if it's G sharp at the bottom, G sharp, B, D, F, that's a diminished 7th in the key of A. If I do B, D, F, G sharp, it's first inversion. D, F, G sharp, B, second inversion. F, G sharp, B, D, third inversion. If it's A flat, B, D, F, A flat, they're all genuine minor thirds, so that is a root position diminished 7th in the key of C, C major or C minor. First inversion, second inversion, third inversion. Okay, the examples that I'm going to use in this video are all in C major. So it's good to just think of it in C major in a key that's got no sharps or flats. And then you can think, can I work this out in other keys? But having recapped on the diminished 7th, what I'm now going to do is talk about what we call approach chords. So in other words, if you want to use a diminished 7th, what are the best chords to put before? Now, you may well find there are other chords that I'm not going to talk about that you think, great, that works really well. Or that's a slightly unusual approach chord, but it works really well in the context of the piece that I'm writing or playing. Brilliant. What I'm talking about is kind of standard approaches, really. So one thing to consider is that a tonic chord goes before a diminished 7th quite nicely. So here's a tonic chord of C major, followed by a diminished 7th. Okay, so you can see that diminished 7th is B, D, F, A flat, and I've just got that organized across the 4 parts. And it follows on from chord 1 very smoothly, doesn't it? There's a chord 1, a tonic chord, onto the diminished 7th. So you can see that it sounds good, and also the part writing is rather good, isn't it? You know, see all these parts just moving by step. So in this particular example, the upper 3 parts all moving up 1 note and the bass part moving down 1 note. So that's quite handy. Now, there's nothing to say that we couldn't use this tonic chord in first inversion. So have it as a 1B or as a 1/6. And then you can see that I might organize things slightly differently. So here's a 1 in first inversion, followed by a diminished 7th. And you can see I've used the diminished 7th in a different inversion as well, because if it's B, D, F, A flat, well, F in the bottom of that is going to make it a second inversion. So 1 in first inversion going to a diminished 7th in the second inversion. And again, you see what I'm trying to do? Keep these parts moving by step whenever possible. It makes it a nice smooth transition. If you've got all your parts leaping all over the place, it's never going to be quite as convincing. Here's another arrangement of the same thing. So I'm starting with 1 in first inversion and just rearranging the innards of the diminished 7th chord. So you could do that. You see what I've done there? You know, in this example, the soprano is doing what the tenor did here. The tenor here is doing what the soprano did there. It's just illustrating that you can rearrange things accordingly. Or what about this one, where I take the first inversion tonic chord, and this time I go to a first inversion diminished 7th. Works quite well as well. Now, you might just say, well, hang on a minute, that tenor part's not going by step, it's leaping a 4th. Well, indeed it is, but you've still got 3 parts all going by step. So if 1 part leaps, that's fine. So you can hear there's just sort of different nuance in that, isn't there? 1 going to a diminished 7th, 1 in first inversion going to a diminished 7th, 1 in first inversion going to a different arrangement, 1 in first inversion going to a different inversion. So it's quite flexible, isn't it? But you can use 1 or 1 in first inversion very effectively as approach chords. Why am I not talking about 1 in second inversion? It's possible you could go from 1 in second inversion to a diminished 7th. The only trouble with that is that if you use a second inversion chord, that already has a pull that sort of wants to go to this, you know. 4 goes to 3, 6 goes to 5. That's often how those second inversion chords want to be handled. So you can sort of do this onto a diminished 7th, but it's a less frequently used progression, let's put it that way. So I'm trying to talk about the strongest approaches here. Okay, well, if you're happy using chord 1 or 1 in first inversion as an approach, that's great. But what are the other options open to us? Well, one option is actually to think about chord 2. Now, let's consider this. If I use chord 2, followed by the diminished seventh, you can hear that actually works pretty well as well, doesn't it? So you might be slightly surprised that 2 followed by a diminished seventh is a front runner, but it is. Why is that? Well, I think one reason is you've got 2 notes in common, D, D, F, F, and then you've only got 2 moving parts. So the alto part in this example going by step chromatically as well, and just this slight leap in the bass of a third. So it's a pretty stable progression, especially with those 2 common notes. Now, you could use your chord 2 in first inversion. And then if you follow it with a diminished seventh, well, you could use different inversions of a diminished seventh. I've used this particular inversion of a diminished seventh. You can see this is the diminished seventh used in second inversion, simply because it gives you the same bass note, which is quite effective. So that's quite nice. Now, nothing to say you couldn't go from there to a different inversion of it. You know, that would be all right. You could do that, I suppose. But this one works particularly well. Okay, I've just put a little note on the side here that 2 in root position is best avoided in minor keys. Now, that's simply because chord 2 in a minor key is a diminished chord. So in root position, it sort of sounds a bit ugly. As soon as you put it in first inversion, it sounds much better. So if you go from there to a diminished seventh, that's fine. So minor keys, if you're going to use 2, much better to use 2 in first inversion than 2 in root position. Okay, well, what other options do we have? What about chord 4? That's quite a handy one. Have a look at what I've done here. And again, you can see that I'm using F in the bass of this diminished seventh this time. So I've got it in second inversion again. Why have I done that? Because there's a common note that I can use in the bass. So here's 4, going to the diminished seventh. And this is showing you that it's possible to have leaps as long as you've got enough stability. So I've got that common note that I've used in the bass. I've got the alto just going by that chromatic step. The tenor is, you know, a little bit iffy, isn't it? Leaping a tritone. If you do that sort of thing, you probably want to step up to the next note. The next note in the tenor might be C, and then, you know, it will sound a bit better. So if you do that and then go down to B and then C, that will mitigate the tritone a bit. But because you've got enough stability here and there, and this interval is not great, you can kind of conceal that one in the middle, depending on how it progresses. But 4 onto a diminished seventh, absolutely perfectly reasonable thing to do. Okay, what about 4 in first inversion? Yeah, sorry, I should have put a B on that one, shouldn't I? Let's just add that on now. There you go. So we've got 4 in first inversion. So 4B or 4/6. Well, here's this one. Going on to a diminished seventh here. Now you can see what I've done here. I've used the diminished seventh in the last inversion. I'm just trying to show you different possibilities with different inversions, and just to point out some of the benefits of your choice of inversion. So here, nice common note, but this time I've got it in the top. It was in the bottom there. Now it's at the top. All this going by step. So it's pretty stable, isn't it? To go from 4 in first inversion onto a diminished seventh in its last inversion. Doesn't have to be in its last inversion. You could go somewhere else. But notice this, beware of false relations, particularly when you're using 4 in first inversion in major keys. Because it's quite easy to do something like this, where say you've got this 4 in first inversion that I've just played, and you've got A natural in the bass. Then say we go on to this version of a diminished seventh. So I've got F in the bass, B in the tenor, A flat in the alto, D in the soprano. you notice I've got A flat in the alto. Well, A natural in the bass, followed by A flat in the alto. That's the same note with a different accidental in a different octave between one chord and the next. That's called false relations. So it's better to try and avoid false relations. So by doing what I've done, having the A natural in the bass for the 4 in first inversion, and then saying, I'll tell you what, I'll have the A flat in the bass, I've kept it in the same part, in the same octave, and therefore it's not a false relation. But if it jumps into a different octave and I've got A natural followed by A flat in a different octave and a different part, I'm definitely in the world of false relations. And there's just something about that you hear that just makes it feel slightly uncomfortable. Okay, so there are some obvious chords, but we're not done yet, because what's wrong with an approach from the dominant chord? Well, chord 5. Nice strong chord, isn't it? In the hierarchy of chords, it's the strongest chord after the tonic chord. So what about 5? Here's chord 5, followed by a diminished 7th. And I've used this in this case in its root position. So you can hear that sounds quite good, especially when you can hear it going on to the next possible chord. Okay, just beware, as I've noted here, of melodic augmented seconds in both the major and the minor key. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you've got this issue about having an A flat in the diminished 7th, whether you're in C minor or in C major. And if you have that next to B natural in the same part, so say the alto part goes B natural, A flat, well, that's an augmented second. And one thing we try to do when we're writing harmony is to avoid writing melodic augmented seconds. In other words, an augmented second within one part, the soprano or the alto or the tenor or the bass. It's just another slightly uncomfortable interval that we get. It often afflicts us in minor keys, but when you're using a diminished 7th, it can get you even in major keys, especially when you're approaching from chord 5. So just something to watch out for there. Just a question of organizing the parts so you don't go B to A flat in the same part when you're going from 5 to a diminished 7th. And again, you could use other inversions of that, but that's where you've got to be a bit careful, because when you do use other inversions, you might well find yourself going B, A flat in the alto or the tenor. So 5 is definitely a possibility, but also, of course, 5 in first inversion. So, here's a couple of examples. Here's 5 in first inversion, followed by a diminished 7th. And this time the diminished 7th is in the root position. And you can see that's a nice progression because you've got a common note in the bass, 2 Bs, common note in the alto as I've written it here. So 2 common notes between 5 and that diminished 7th. Quite useful, isn't it? And so then your other parts, you've got one moving down by step, one moving up by step. It's an ideal bit of voice leading, nice and stable. But there's nothing to say that you couldn't do something like this, where I'm using 5 in first inversion again, and this time using the diminished 7th in its first inversion. So that involves a few leaps, but it's okay. It's quite a nice intimate sound, isn't it? And again, you've got this part going by step, this part going by step, that's going down a third, that's going up a third. Well, that's quite a nice balance of movement within those chords, isn't it? So 5B, perfectly possible, possibly going on to, a different inversion. That's what I'm trying to show there. Okay, any more? Well, what about chord 6? Well, the only thing I'm going to say about 6 is that it works much better in minor keys than it does in major keys for reasons that I'll explain. So if I take chord 6 in C minor, that's an A flat major chord, and then I go diminished 7th, that's quite a nice progression, isn't it? Again, why does it work? I've got a common note in the bass in this particular example, and you can see I've put the diminished 7th this time in its last inversion, but it gives me a nice common note in the bass, doesn't it? Stepwise movement in the tenor, stepwise movement in the alto, only a third in the soprano part, so very kind of stable movement. Okay, well, if I can use 6 in a minor key, why can't I use 6 in a major key? Well, you can, but it can be awkward. Let's imagine for a moment that we're going to treat this as 6 in C major instead of C minor. That would give us this chord: A natural, E natural, C, A natural. Well, if I go from there onto this diminished seventh, can you hear false relations? A natural soprano, A flat bass. You see, it's a bit uncomfortable, isn't it? When you've got that same note, different accidental, different part, different octave. False relations. So it's quite difficult to avoid false relations when you're using 6 in a major key, but 6 in a minor key is ideal because in this case the A is already flat. So you haven't got a problem when it comes to those false relations. And of course, it's perfectly possible in the minor key to use 6 in first inversion. So here's an example of that. And again, you know, you're not using common notes here, are you? But nice stepwise movement there, you know, that's all working all right, isn't it? It's a sort of bit more of a leap there, going up a fourth, but stepwise movement, just a minor third there. It's all about that balance. If everybody's doing big leaps, it's not so good. If you've got common notes or some parts moving by step or minimal intervals, minor thirds, you can cope with the odd part leaping. So I hope that's useful because we've had people get in touch with us to say, oh great, I've got the diminished seventh chord now, but I never kind of know what to write before it. So what I've tried to explain in this video is, well, what are the most common approach chords? In other words, what's the chords that's going to work best before my diminished seventh? And by experimenting and by composing in different styles and contexts, you'll come up with all sorts of other possibilities. But if you want to play safe and you want to know which of the chords that I know are going to work, here they are, and I've just tried to point out some of the pitfalls just to help you think about voice leading, what we're doing with leaps and steps, what we're doing with common notes, and encouraging you to think about this issue of false relations so we don't bump into them either. So I hope that's useful on diminished sevenths and their approach chords. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, let me invite you to take a trip to the Music Matters website, which is a very exciting place to spend a bit of time. www.mmcourses.co.uk. And if you're really wanting to get this harmony under your fingers and explore the diatonic chords and all the chromatic chords and modulation and all the rest of it, let me point you to our keyboard harmony course. The keyboard harmony course is amazingly practical. It explains the theory behind the chords, but it really gets you moving under the fingers, listening to, feeling where your fingers need to go on the keys. So if you really want to get this going under your fingers, so maybe you can improvise more freely, compose more freely, hear more clearly what's going on, that could be a really useful course for you to follow. Lots of other stuff on the website, other courses, maestros. Have a little look, see what you can find there. www.mmcourses.co.uk.